Imagine a king so powerful that a single word of his could decide the fate of thousands. And yet there was something capable of making this man tremble like a child. Something no army could face. Something no sage could explain. Something that could not be touched, nor imprisoned, nor destroyed. His own shadow. Yes. The simplest, most harmless, most constant thing was what terrified him. And before you think this is an exaggeration, listen to this. On the night the king realized his shadow was following him, he ordered all palace windows to be locked, all torches to be put out, and commanded the guards not to let any ray of light enter the room. But it was no use, because even in absolute darkness, he still saw it, a black outline that appeared behind him, even when there was zero light, as if it wasn't a shadow, but a living echo of a dirty memory of what he was trying to hide. And that night, the servants swore they heard the king whisper, "She knows too much. She always knows too much." Minutes later, the entire palace awoke to a scream so deep, so full of despair, that even the most brutal soldiers felt their stomachs turn. When they broke down the bedroom door, they found the king on the floor trembling, staring fixedly at the empty wall, and repeating, like a maddened mantra, "She spoke to me. My shadow spoke to me." But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that the wall he was pointing to was completely dark. No torches, no reflection, no light, and yet all present claimed to have seen a dark trace slowly gliding like a crawling animal. An impossible movement. From that night on, the king, the most feared, most venerated, most respected man, began to lose control of his own kingdom and his own mind. And no one knew why. Only after his death, upon opening a secret diary hidden behind the throne, did people learn the truth. A truth so dark, so psychologically profound, that it would forever change the way we understand human fear. A truth that said, "The shadow did not follow me. It anticipated me." From here, you will discover why the human mind is capable of creating monsters that even reality cannot extinguish, and how a king who dominated the world was dominated by the only enemy born with each of us, our own psyche. The story of the king tormented by his own shadow never appeared in history books. It was erased, buried, rewritten, and hidden for centuries, not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too dangerous. Dangerous for the monarchy, dangerous for religion, dangerous for human understanding itself. Because, unlike other stories of madness, this one did not begin with treason, poison, war, or conspiracy. It began with a small detail, so small that any other man would have ignored it. But he couldn't. One seemingly ordinary morning, as his servants dressed him in the royal robes, the king noticed that his shadow was delayed. Yes, it did not keep pace with his movements. It took fractions of a second to react, as if it were deciding whether to follow him or not. At first, he thought it was fatigue, or maybe the light was different. But as the days passed, the delay increased, and in some situations, it seemed like his shadow moved before he moved, as if it knew his thoughts before they were executed. The counselors attributed it to stress. The doctors blamed the excessive responsibilities. The monks said it was the influence of ancient spirits. But none of them realized what was truly happening, because the king's problem was not spiritual. It was not mystical. It was not supernatural. It was psychological, deeply psychological. The king, behind the image of strength, was a man full of fears he would never confess to anyone. Fear of failing, fear of being seen as weak, fear of repeating his father's mistakes, and above all, fear of himself. His shadow was not an external enemy. It was the living projection of everything he hid, the part of his psyche he refused to face. But the more he tried to ignore it, the more it grew. The more he tried to flee, the more it pursued him. The more he tried to control it, the more it rebelled. The shadow became darker, denser, more conscious. And this is where the psychological mystery becomes truly fascinating. Did the shadow gain life? Or did the king lose his own? What was happening behind the scenes of his mind? How can a monarch be destroyed by something that is literally a part of himself? In the next parts of this video, you will understand how this phenomenon connects to real studies in modern psychology, Jung Freud defense mechanisms, emotional repression, and how anyone even today can be pursued by their own shadow without realizing it. But before diving deeper into this dark story, if you've made it this far, it's because this type of narrative captivates you. And this channel is made exactly for those who love intense psychological stories like this one. So, subscribe now so you don't miss the next stories. Just click. It takes less than a second, and you directly help keep this type of content alive. Here on YouTube, after the first night, the king saw his shadow move on its own. Something changed inside the palace. The corridors grew quieter. The servants began to walk with light steps, as if fearing to wake something dormant in the walls. And the king no longer ruled. He merely survived. Everything began to escalate slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack in a castle that seems harmless, until the day it brings everything down. One morning, during the ceremony in the royal hall, the king raised his hand to bless the people and realized his shadow remained with its arm lowered, paralyzed, immobile. In front of hundreds of people, he froze. His eyes widened. His heart pounded so hard the echoes sounded like a drum inside his chest. He lowered his arm. The shadow remained with its arm raised. A delay. A trick of the light. A momentary illusion. No one noticed. Only him. And that was worse, because doubt began to devour his mind. Was he going mad? Or did the shadow truly want to be him? From then on, each day was stranger than the last. At night, the guards swore they heard footsteps in the king's corridor. Even when he was fast asleep, light steps, dragging, as if someone walked without legs, just gliding. The palace dogs began to howl whenever he entered a room, not at the king, but at the floor behind him. And little by little, the king himself began to notice signs he couldn't explain. Sometimes, his shadow was bigger than normal. Other times, smaller than it should be. And in rare moments, it disappeared completely. The king started testing the shadow in secret. He moved to the left, the shadow lagged. He moved to the right, the shadow anticipated him. Sometimes, it seemed like it knew the step before he took it. The tension reached its limit when, in a silent early morning, waking up with the sensation of being observed, the king saw something impossible. His shadow was standing, but his body was still sitting in bed. It was as if the shadow had risen on its own. He was so paralyzed with panic that it took him seconds to remember to breathe. And the shadow, slowly, very slowly, turned its head towards him. Even though it was just a black outline, the king swore he saw a smile. Not a human smile, a smile of someone patiently waiting for you to collapse. In that moment, something broke inside him. The shadow was no longer an effect of the light. It was no longer a metaphor. It was a being that no longer obeyed natural rules. And the more he tried to understand, the more terrified he became. The shadow seemed to gain strength the greater his fear, as if it fed directly on what he most hid: his failures, his traumas, his deep insecurity. And, without realizing it, the king was entering the final phase of mental collapse. The phase where the mind no longer distinguishes between an external enemy and an internal enemy, where fear ceases to be a visitor and becomes the ruler. But nothing, absolutely nothing, would prepare him for what came next. The moment the shadow would stop imitating him and begin to separate from him. To understand what was happening to the king, we need to look beyond the story and see the psychological mechanism that was forming within him. Because, however supernatural everything seemed, every piece of this terror had a real, studied, and documented basis in modern psychology. The phenomenon begins with something Carl Jung called the shadow, the dark part of the mind, that holds everything we try to deny about ourselves: traumas, shame, hidden anger, forbidden desires, fears we never admit. Every human being carries this, but most suffocate it, repress it, push it into a corner. Yet, what is repressed does not disappear. On the contrary, it grows in the dark. And that is exactly what happened to the king. For years, he built the image of a perfect ruler, strong, invincible, immune to failure. But behind the crown, there existed a completely broken man, marked by a violent father, by wars he never wanted to fight, and by the guilt of decisions that took too many lives. He never spoke about it with anyone. He never admitted it. He never faced it. And the mind did what it always does when we try to run from our own reflection. It transformed fear into form. The shadow became the living repository of everything the king rejected, and the more he tried to be strong, the more this repressed part gained autonomy. This autonomy was not magic. It was pure psychology. First stage, mild dissociation. The king saw the shadow delayed, a classic symptom of fragmented perception. Second stage, displacement. He began to attribute intentions to the shadow because it was easier than admitting his own flaws. Third stage, externalization. His mind projected internal emotions onto something external so as not to deal with them directly. Fourth stage, tactile and visual hallucinations, common in extreme cases of stress, paranoia, and emotional breakdown. All of this, mixed with sleepless nights, continuous fear, and emotional isolation, created the perfect scenario for the collapse. But there is one more element, and this one is crucial. The king deeply believed that his shadow had a consciousness of its own, and the human brain, when it believes in something with absolute force, molds reality to fit the belief. This is one of the most frightening discoveries of modern psychology. The mind does not differentiate between what is intensely imagined and what is real. If you believe enough, the brain activates the same circuits, the same physiological responses, the same emotional triggers. That is how the shadow began to move on its own. Not because it was a living being, but because the king's brain was creating mirror movements, delays, visual distortions, all of it fueled by the terrifying conviction that this shadow was an intellect, an enemy. And when the mind decides the enemy is internal, it creates an entire stage within the psyche. That's why the shadow seemed to change size, disappear, or move ahead. It was the perfect personification of what the king was trying to hide. His fears growing, shrinking, fleeing, attacking, all at the same time. The footsteps in the corridor, auditory symptoms of extreme stress, the smile perceived in the dark outline, projective interpretation, the brain giving shape to emotions. But none of this means the danger was not real. On the contrary, when the mind loses the boundary between the internal and external world, it becomes capable of destroying the body itself, the life itself, the identity itself. And the king was about to move to the final stage, the moment the shadow ceases to symbolize fear and begins to replace it. The king's psychological spiral seemed to have reached its limit. But the human mind has a cruel talent for finding new abysses just when we believe we've hit rock bottom. And that is exactly what happened. The first turning point occurred in the Hall of Mirrors, a place the king avoided, but was forced to cross during a ceremony. There, his reflection multiplied into dozens, but only one detail chilled the king's blood. In one of the reflections, the shadow was not behind him, it was beside him, and it did not imitate his movements. As the king breathed quickly, trying to control his panic, one of the mirrors revealed something that would break any sanity. The shadow turned its face toward him, directly, as if it were tired of observing, and finally ready to act. The king fell to the floor. The guards ran, but when they arrived, everything seemed normal, and this made everything even more disturbing. Because what happens when you see something impossible and no one else sees it? The second shock came days later. During a meeting with his generals, the king interrupted a military strategy. Staring at the floor in horror, everyone looked. Nothing was there. But he clearly saw the shadow projected on the wall. Making a gesture he immediately recognized, it was pointing at one of the generals. That night, the general was found dead. No signs of struggle, no injuries, no explanation. just a face frozen in absolute terror, as if he had seen something the mind refused to register. The king wouldn't even matter, and began to believe that his shadow was choosing victims. The court descended into silent panic. Some ministers fled, others prepared coup plans. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse. But the final twist was still to come. The twist no one in the palace ever forgot. One night, the king ordered torches lit throughout the room, light in every direction, without a single dark corner. His desperate attempt to dominate what tormented him. But the shadow appeared anyway, only this time. It wasn't behind him, not beside him, not on the walls. It was on the throne, seated, erect, reigning, a perfect silhouette, immobile, authoritarian, the exact representation of what the king pretended to be, but never was. He fell to his knees, unable to breathe, and, for the first time, he heard not a whisper, but a clear, deep, firm voice, a voice that seemed to come from inside his own skull. "I am who you tried to bury." The king began to scream, tearing the crown from his head as if it were burning his skin. Guards broke down the door, servants ran, but no one saw the shadow on the throne, only the king, and this made everything even more real for him. The shadow slowly stood up, and the terrified king backed away until he hit the wall. For him, it was like watching himself come to life and demand what was rightfully its. And then came the most brutal turning point of all. The shadow took a step forward, and the king instantly fainted, as if his mind had shut down to avoid dying of fear. The next morning, upon waking, something was different, something that would leave the entire kingdom frozen in the following weeks. The king began to act as if nothing had happened, serene, controlled, confident, with an artificial calm that frightened even the most experienced soldiers. But his eyes had changed, the look of a man who was no longer alone inside his own mind. The problem is that this calm only marked the beginning of the worst, because everyone realized, slowly, that something fundamental had been inverted. The shadow was no longer pursuing the king. The king was obeying it. The entire kingdom noticed the change. The king walked with slow, calculated steps, almost choreographed. He spoke little, slept even less, and always seemed to be observing something no one else could see. But the true climax of this story began on a stormy night when the sky was torn by thunder that seemed to announce the end of everything. The guards rotated shifts outside the royal chamber, uneasy. There were rumors that the king talked to himself, and increasingly, his voice seemed doubled, as if there were another voice mixed with his own. At midnight, the entire palace was shaken by a violent noise coming from the main hall. The guards ran, swords in hand. As they entered, they froze. The king was standing before the throne, but the shadow was seated upon it, projected on the wall, as if occupying the place it had always desired. And this time, the guards saw it. Everyone saw it. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't an isolated delusion. The shadow seemed to have gained density, presence, intention. The king, his breath catching, reached out his hand to the dark outline, as if begging for mercy. But the shadow merely lifted its head. And then the most terrifying moment in history happened. The moment the most powerful man in the kingdom realized he no longer had control even over his own body. He began to speak, but the words were not his. "I waited for this. You locked me up for years. Now it's my turn." The voice came out of the king's mouth, but his lips were not moving. The guards tried to approach, but the room grew darker, as if the shadow was sucking the light. The torches flickered. The air grew heavy. One of the guards fell to his knees, saying he felt someone breathing inside his head. And then the king fell. Not passed out, not dead. The body simply collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. But the shadow remained standing, erect, before everyone. The king's mind had completely fragmented. The repressed part, his fears, guilt, traumas, impulses, had finally taken control. And the shadow, now independent, seemed to carry everything he had tried to hide his entire life. The The king began to crawl backward, crying like a child, repeating, "I did everything right. I did everything right." But the shadow advanced, slow, calculated, relentless. With every step, the king lost more control over himself. His hands trembled. His voice failed. His eyes rolled back. The fight was not physical. It was internal. It was the final battle between the man and what he himself had created. And then, before the entire court, the moment that would become legend happened, told in whispers for generations. The shadow entered the king, not like a ghost, not like an entity, but like an idea that finally occupied the throne that was always hers. The king's body arched. His eyes went completely dark for a second, and when he returned to normal, the man who stood up was not the same. He picked up the crown from the floor, placed it on his head with an almost mechanical precision, and said in an unimaginably calm voice, "Now, we are one." The shadow disappeared from the wall. The hall returned to normal, and everyone realized the truth. The king had not defeated the shadow. The shadow had defeated the king. The darkest part of him became who he was. The perfect ruler disappeared, and in his place, a version of him was born that had no fear, no guilt, no limits. The kingdom would never be the same. The king lived for many more years after that day. He ruled with surgical efficiency, impeccable strategy, and a coldness that frightened even the most brutal enemies. Some said he had finally found his true self. Others believed he had lost everything that made him human. But the truth is much deeper. Because what occurred on that throne was not a possession. It was not magic. It was not a supernatural phenomenon. It was what happens when a human being spends an entire life running from themselves, when they repress their fears, their traumas, their pain so much that these forgotten parts become wild, and one day demand what is theirs. The king's shadow did not destroy him. It merely took the place that always belonged to it, the place he abandoned when he decided to pretend to be perfect. And this is where this story becomes more than a dark narrative. It becomes a mirror for every person who has ever tried to bury what they feel, pretend they don't suffer, and hide what they fear. We are made of light and shadow, and every time we try to be only light, the shadow grows. It watches, it accumulates strength, until, one day, it demands to be seen. The king was afraid of his own shadow, but deep down, what terrified him was not the darkness, but the truth that he was never as strong as he pretended, never as secure as he appeared, never as armored as the world believed. And this is what modern psychology confirms. There is no escaping oneself. We can run from the entire world, but we cannot run from what lives inside our own head. The shadow he saw on the floor was not a monster. It was a request to be heard, to be integrated, to be understood. But, like many, he chose repression. And, as always happens when repression is absolute, the shadow took the throne. This is the final lesson of this story. Denying who we are is handing over control to what we fear most. And facing our own darkness is the only way not to be dominated by it. Now, before I conclude, let me tell you something important, not just for the story, but for this channel. If you have made it this far, it says a lot about who you are. Someone who enjoys deep, psychological, dense stories that make you think and feel at the same time. So, subscribe to the channel now. This helps YouTube understand that this type of content deserves to continue existing, and it makes the algorithm take these videos to other people who also need to hear them. Truly, your subscription makes a huge difference in the reach of this work. Also leave a like, because that shows that this video was worthwhile for you and helps with recommendations. And tell me in the comments, which part of this story resonated with you the most? What do you think the shadow represented? Have you ever been afraid of something that, deep down, came from yourself? I read everything. Now, before you go, do one thing. Watch the video that is appearing on your screen now. It is even more intense, more profound, and more fascinating than this one. If you enjoyed this journey, the next one will captivate you even more. See you there.